Hi everybody, it's Mr. Mahar here. Welcome to our first unit, which is Introduction to Short Fiction or Short Stories. What I'm going to do in this PowerPoint is I've copied and pasted some important information from that document that I posted in your Content tab. It just showed up today on your D2L page. And I'm just going to go over some of the information from there, go a little bit more in depth so that you understand the new material. So what is a short story? Well, a short story is a fictional work, meaning that it is not real and made up and created by the author, that is obviously shorter in length than a novel. Whenever I introduce short stories to a class, I will often ask, what do you think the difference is between a short story and a novel? And someone will try to be funny and put their hand up and say, well, a short story is shorter. And they're absolutely right. A short story, because it is shorter, is usually only concerned with one or two main events. Okay, maybe one or two main conflicts or significant scenes, because they just don't have the luxury of having the amount of pages to focus on multiple characters or multiple scenes. So it is usually focused on one main idea. That brings us to plot. So whenever we're talking about plot, I want you to think about what is happening. So the plot is how the author arranges events to develop that basic idea. So it is what is happening, but also the sequence and the way that the author arranges events in a story. Now, what we have is whenever we're looking at a short story, we often try to fit it into what's called a plot graph. And this is how we organize events to understand the material and what the author is trying to do. So we start with the introduction, or what's often called the exposition, and this is essentially the start of the short story where you are introduced to the basic situation, so what's going on, the characters involved, so the characters that are going to be focused on, as well as the setting. So where are you? Now, one thing that's important about the exposition is that I often like to think of it as a hook. If it is extremely boring in the first couple sentences, the reader is going to want to put the book down. So you usually have to try and engage the audience in some way so that they're interested in the story that is about to be told. Next, we have the inciting incident. Now, this is the first major incident that sets the story in motion. So you kind of think of it as something that gets the ball rolling. You kind of see the direction that the story's going in, so that a reader has an idea of what to expect. After that, you have the rising action, and I want you to think of the rising action as something that creates suspense or builds up a conflict that might happen in the short story. Without a conflict in a short story, it would be very uninteresting, okay, very boring. So in the rising action, it often builds suspense and tension for the audience. Once you get past the rising action, we are at what's called the climax, and that is the highest point of the story. The climax is where, as a reader, you should feel the highest emotional impact, meaning that the tension has hit its peak, and you are on the edge of your seat wondering what is going to happen. The main character, might have to make a key decision. It might be the highest point of the conflict. And what's interesting about the climax is it can be subjective, meaning what you think the climax is might not be the same as Mr. Mahar. And that's okay. You might be right, I might be right, as long as we prove it with justification. As long as we can justify that this was the highest point of the story, and here's why I felt that. The next part of the plot graph, I want you to think of it as what goes up must come down. So that has the falling action. When we talk about the falling action, we are looking at the direct consequences from the climax. So it's very connected and related to what has just happened. We either see a character complete the actions of his or her decision, We see events beginning to resolve themselves or not. And that is where we are starting to get at the final point of the story, which is called the resolution. Now, the resolution doesn't necessarily mean a solution to the end of the story. This is when there's a final outcome or the untangling of events in the particular story. Now, what I mean by that it's not necessarily a solution is that an author may choose to not have loose ends tied up, or they may have a surprise ending with a twist that might make the audience think about something. So the resolution is the final point of the story, but not necessarily a solution. It could be a happy ending, it could be a sad ending. That is up to the creativity of the author. Now, I know that you all know what setting is, but there's three things that I want you to keep in mind when we are reading a short story, or any story for that matter. And that is the time. So, what time of day is the story taking place? The location. So, what is the place exactly? And the atmosphere or mood. So, those are the three things that I want you to look at when we are examining setting: time, location, and atmosphere. Okay, because those all impact how the reader feels and the general idea of the story. The next part that we are going to look at is conflict. Without conflict, a short story would be very boring. Nothing would happen that would be of interest. Without conflict, there is no plot. Now, conflict is the opposition of forces which tie one incident to another. It makes the plot move. Now, when you think of conflict, you usually think of a physical altercation. So I have a picture there of a cartoon guy getting punched in the face. Now, that is absolutely an example of conflict. But there are also different types of conflict that are a little trickier to locate. And that is when we get into the two types of conflict. So we are looking at external. So that is a struggle with a force outside of oneself. So that would be the example of someone getting punched in the face. You have no control over what's happening to you. That is coming outside of yourself. And then we have internal conflict, which is a struggle within oneself. Now, that might be a person has to make a really tough decision on their own and they're not sure what to do. Someone who struggles with addiction or something like that could be an example of internal conflict. So I have a picture of Winnie the Pooh there trying to make a decision, and he just can't. I have the types of conflict listed here for you. I'm not going to go in too much detail of them. We'll talk about them a little later in the course. But we have person versus self. So that would be the main character versus themselves, which is the only example of internal conflict. The other examples of conflict are all external. So the first external conflict we already talked about, which is person versus person. This would be an example of a physical altercation or a physical fight, a verbal fight between two people. That would be person versus person. It could be the main character versus a group of people. It is still called person versus person. The second one, we have person versus society. So this would be someone struggling, let's say, with a certain law or political system. That would be person versus society. The next is person versus nature. Let's say somebody is stuck in a story in the middle of a storm, and it's causing them great conflict and grief. That would be person versus nature. Person versus technology, which we will explore in depth in a later story next week, is technology versus person. Let's say Mr. Mahar was having trouble with D2L. That would be an example of person versus technology. And then we have person versus supernatural. So that could be Mr. Mahar thinks he sees a ghost, and he's very scared. Now, finally, we come to one of the most important aspects of any story, And this is going to be important throughout high school and something that you are going to focus on in every course. So grade 9, 10, 11, and 12, you will always be looking for theme. And theme's a little bit tricky to understand at first until you get the general idea of how to identify a theme. Now, a theme in a piece of fiction is the controlling idea or the central insight. So what is the author really doing? Okay, what is their main focus? What is the topic? It is the author's underlying meaning or main idea that they are trying to convey. Now, in order to really understand how to identify themes, it's good to think of examples that we really know and stories that we know and try to identify their theme. There can be multiple themes within a story. It's just that when we're talking about short stories, there's probably only one or two because remember, it's much shorter than a novel, so you can't really piece together a lot of different themes. So when we talk about Romeo and Juliet, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with this story, but you have Romeo from one family and Juliet from the other. Now the families hate each other, but Romeo and Juliet fall in love to the dismay of their families. So focused on theme in that play is forbidden love, okay? And that is kind of the central idea. Everything, the plot, the events, the conflict is based on the idea of forbidden love. So we would call that a theme. In the Hunger Games, we have Katniss who often feels isolated from the world, physically and mentally. So that would be the theme of isolation. And then we have Harry Potter. Through all the books and films, we often focus on the idea of good versus evil. Okay, so Harry versus Voldemort. That is something that is focused on throughout all of the texts. Okay, so the idea that we have a good side and a bad, and they are opposing forces for each other. So those are just examples of themes for you. Now, your task for today is pretty simple. All that you have to do is create your own plot graph for a made-up event, or it can be a real event, or conflict of your choice. So what you're going to do is you're going to give your little story a title, and all that you're going to do is fill out the exposition, inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Now this will be, you'll probably have a sentence or two for each one, and I'd like you to list it just as I have here on your PowerPoint. So as an example, we could do Mr. Mahar lost his puppy. That's the title, okay? And we have the exposition. Mr. Mahar woke up one morning to walk his dog Max at 7:30 a.m. and on a stormy day. So we have the basic situation, we have the characters, and we have the setting. That's the exposition. So my exposition is done. I would then move to the next one, and then the next one, and so on. Now, I would like you to finish this today and submit it under portfolio, okay? So your paper will look exactly like this PowerPoint slide, and you are going to create your own story. You're not writing the actual story, you're just listing the exposition, inciting incident, rising action, and so on. I want you to refer to the handout and this PowerPoint slide, or this PowerPoint presentation, for you to really try and hammer home what should be in your introduction, inciting incident, what should be in each element of plot, okay? Make sure that you hit the mark on those, do the best that you can. I'm going to be reading them over to make sure that you all understand this, and I will touch base tomorrow with our first story that we are reading.